There is a curve in life that most people never notice. It doesn't appear on any map, isn't taught in schools, isn't marked on calendars, and isn't passed down through family wisdom. Yet one day it arrives, quietly, unexpectedly, and changes everything. This curve often emerges around the age of 60. Outwardly, it may seem as if little has changed. The body moves a bit more slowly, the days become simpler, emotions settle into a gentle calm. But inside, something fundamental begins to shift. The soul quietly changes its direction. This isn't a sudden break or a visible transformation. It's more like an inner current that stops caring about the same old goals. The urge to please others fades. The need to prove oneself dissolves. Even the ambitions that once burned so brightly begin to lose their urgency. The soul starts to move backward, not as a retreat, but as a symbolic return, as if searching for something left behind in the debris of haste, in the silence of unspoken sacrifices, in the empty spaces we never dared to face. Carl Jung once said that the first half of life is devoted to building the ego, while the second half is about returning to the soul. That return is not easy. It hurts because by 60, the soul can no longer tolerate masks. It rejects pretense. It pushes away everything forced. It demands truth. And truth sometimes means admitting that much of what we lived was simply a way to survive. At 60, many people feel a strange sense of distance, as if the life that once seemed so meaningful now resembles a staged performance. Despite outward stability, many feel a deep kind of fatigue, not physical, but existential. It's not depression, it's clarity. It's the soul whispering, it's time to change direction, to stop searching outward for what can only be found within. In this phase, many begin to re-examine their story, their marriage, their children, their work, their choices, their old wounds. Everything returns not to hurt, but to be integrated. At 60, the soul longs for wholeness. It no longer craves a new title, a new car, or a new body. It craves silence, peace, the assurance that, despite everything, beauty still exists, meaning still exists, something essential still waits to be found. It is a time of symbolic cleansing, a time to open the inner drawers, to discard inherited fears, to forgive those who never knew how to love properly, to release the need to always be strong, to look into the mirror and finally see oneself without masks, without makeup, without lies. Those who walk through this gate with courage discover something rare. They discover that the soul does not age. It simply returns to its purest form. And what once seemed like an ending turns out to be the beginning of a new way of living, deeper, lighter, more true. That is the secret no one talks about, the curve no one points out. But for those who listen to their own soul, it becomes the road that leads home. Some call this time maturity, others call it aging, but there is something beyond words. At 60, the body may slow down, but in the soul, something quietly accelerates, as if everything postponed now demands its space, as if the unfinished business of life gently whispers, now is the time. The strange thing is, this shift doesn't happen on the outside. It happens in the invisible. One day, without any obvious reason, you wake up and feel that certain clothes no longer make sense, that some conversations have become dull, that the things you were once proud of now feel like a burden. The soul begins to ask questions. What still moves me? What part of me remains untouched by others' expectations? What would I do if I no longer had to please anyone? These questions don't arise by chance. They sprout like seeds of a new cycle. Because at 60, time is no longer measured by quantity, but by quality. Urgency no longer comes from the outside, it comes from the soul. Jung believed that after the phase of adaptation and conquest, the psyche seeks reintegration, and that only happens when there's space to confront what's been forgotten. The shadow, as he called it, begins to ask for presence. And the shadow isn't something bad, it's simply what was left out of your story. The parts you couldn't live, the things you had to set aside in order to fit in, the wounded child, the archived dreams, the silenced intuition. At 60, all of that begins to resurface, not as a weight, but as a possibility. It's not uncommon at this stage to feel a sudden urge to change direction, to go back to studying, to end toxic relationships, to begin again right where it once seemed too late. Why? Because the soul doesn't follow the ticking of the clock, it follows the inner call. When the soul realizes that despite all the battles, there is still soul, there is still life, it tries again. It wants to live what remains without pretending. That's why so many women begin to blossom in this stage of life. They stop apologizing. They stop softening their strength. They stop asking for permission to simply exist. The beauty that emerges at 60 has nothing to do with outward appearance. It's about freedom, truth, and wholeness. It is a kind of beauty that unsettles those who still live on the surface because it is too authentic, too quiet, too real. And those who carry it feel no need to prove anything anymore. Perhaps you felt somewhere deep within that this turning point has arrived, that you no longer recognize yourself in your old roles, that there is a longing to go deeper, to care about what truly matters, to say no without guilt, to say yes with your heart. That impulse isn't selfish, it's an awakening, the beginning of a new chapter, one where you no longer live for others, but from within yourself.
And those who embrace this turning point with courage discover something rare, the peace of simply being themselves without fear, because the soul is finally allowed to breathe in its own rhythm again. There's something few people say aloud, but many feel it when they reach this stage of life. The realization that they've spent most of their life living for others, for the children, the partner, the family, the work, the social duties. All of it took up so much space that now there's a strange emptiness, an unoccupied room. And it is in that very space that the soul begins to move. It no longer wants to be useful, it wants to be real. In a world that worships productivity, this might seem strange, but the soul is not here to be productive, it is here to be whole. And at 60, it seems to whisper, "I've followed every command, now it's my turn." This reversal of values can be frightening. Frightening because no one prepares you for it. Society paints aging as a phase of decline, but Jung saw the opposite. To him, this stage of life was the richest, the most symbolic, full of true potential, because now the ego lets go, pride fades, and time begins to reveal what was hidden all along. It's often the case that during this phase of life, old memories return with great force. Childhood moments, significant people, places filled with longing. But this isn't just nostalgia. It's a sign that the soul is reorganizing its archives. It wants to understand what still hurts, what remains unanswered, what still lives on. And for that, it calls for silence. And the soul doesn't shout at this moment, it sighs, it exhales, it whispers between the lines of everyday life. In recurring dreams, in unexpected emotions, in inexplicable yearnings, you begin to realize that some people no longer make sense, that certain opinions no longer move you, that certain wounds no longer define you. It's as if the soul is claiming its autonomy. As if it's saying, "I'm leading now." But for that to happen, you must listen. Listen to the sadness that arises without reason, to the body asking for more rest, to the boredom that sets in where there was once excitement, because all of it is signaling something, a quiet transformation taking place. And this change isn't superficial, it's structural. It tears down old images, dissolves roles, and confronts you with something you may have avoided your entire life, your own truth. At this turning point, many people finally discover spirituality, not as a doctrine, but as lived experience, as a state of presence, as deep inner awareness. Jung once said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by becoming conscious of their own darkness. And at 60, those words carry new weight. Because now, darkness isn't the enemy, it's a threshold. It's the womb in which something new begins to grow. What once seemed like loneliness begins to reveal itself as a meeting with the essential, a meeting with what has always been there, quietly waiting to be embraced. It's fascinating how at 60, even words change their meaning. Time, for instance, no longer means haste. It begins to mean presence. You stop measuring your days by completed tasks and start feeling them through the depth of your moments. The truth in each gesture, the peace that lives in the spaces between. Love also changes at 60. It stops being expectation, stops being fantasy, and becomes a conscious choice. You no longer love to complete something. You love to accompany. Love no longer needs display. It becomes shared silence, a glance that understands, a presence that honors space. Fear, on the other hand, loses its grip. You've seen too much to be frightened by little things. You've fallen and risen so many times that fear becomes just a reminder of how strong you've been. At 60, there is a kind of wisdom that can't be explained, a clarity that doesn't come from books, but from scars, a knowing that lives in the body, speaks through the eyes, and expresses itself effortlessly. And that's exactly why this wisdom unsettles. It disturbs those still acting in the theater of the ego, who confuse worth with appearance, who equate youth with power, without realizing that a ripened soul becomes a fertile ground for creation. Because in this stage of life, the most beautiful things begin to emerge. The deepest stories, the most honest advice, the pauses that heal. But only what had the courage to die can come to life again. At 60, many things must die. The need for approval, the illusion of control, the habit of trying to save everyone, the pressure to be perfect. And when all that dies, something extraordinary happens. You begin to breathe differently. It's as if after decades of constriction, the soul opens a window. And from this inner side, everything feels more alive, more sensitive, more true. That's why many people in this phase feel a deep urge to write, to paint, to walk alone, to study again, to meditate, to travel, not to see places, but to experience themselves in new places. The soul longs for expression. It wants to break out of confinement. It wants to be seen, not for others, but for itself. And every step on this path is a form of healing. A healing that doesn't come from medicine, but from making peace with one's own time. You no longer want to run back into the past, nor rush into the future. You simply want to be here, fully, presently, and that is the most beautiful form of wisdom, to be in the now, with everything you are, without hiding anything, without apologizing for how long it took, without asking for permission to begin again. There is an inner season that only blooms after 60. It doesn't resemble the spring of youth, full of haste and promises. It's a quieter, more mature spring, grown from roots that have survived many storms. And when it blooms with truth. This season follows a different rhythm. It doesn't ask much of the body, but it asks a great deal of the soul. It invites you to revisit the quiet agreements of your life, the silenced words, the painful compromises, the childhood promises made in the mirror. It's a time of reconciliation with your own story. But unlike before, there is no blame now. There is compassion. You no longer scold yourself for what you did wrong. You accept it, understand it, and embrace your former selves with the tenderness of someone who knows they did the best they could with what they had. This understanding is not passive. It's liberating, because only those who truly forgive themselves can move on lightly. And lightness becomes urgent at 60. Not a superficial lightness that pretends nothing hurts, but a conscious lightness that acknowledges the pain is there, but no longer rules. That longing still exists, but no longer weighs heavily. That absence still lingers, but no longer paralyzes. Jung called this process a late individuation. It's as if the soul, after years of adjusting to the world, finally says, "Now I want to find myself." And that discovery is the most beautiful of all, because it is quiet, deep, true. It needs no audience, no approval, no explanation. It's simply a return. At 60, this return reveals itself in small gestures: a walk without destination, a book that brings tears, an old song that awakens forgotten memories, a sunset that suddenly feels new, a reconnection with someone who's long lived inside of you. The soul becomes touched by simple things, not because it's become overly sensitive, but because it is finally unguarded, no longer armored, no longer afraid to feel. This sensitivity is not weakness, it is refined strength. It is the result of everything that's been lived through, overcome, and deeply felt. And at the same time, it is the doorway to that rare kind of wisdom, the kind that doesn't seek to teach, but to inspire. At 60, you no longer need to convince anyone. You simply live in truth, with dignity, with presence. And that presence touches others, your children, your grandchildren, your friends, even strangers. Because when a soul becomes whole, it illuminates everything around it. There is a kind of beauty that only appears when the rush is gone. It shows in the lines of the face, in the pauses between words, in eyes that have seen much and can still be moved. It is a beauty without makeup, without filters, without effort. And for that very reason, it is the rarest kind. This beauty doesn't shout, it radiates. It doesn't demand attention, it remains. And those who possess it often don't even realize it, because they've spent a lifetime trying to conform to standards that never recognized their light. But at 60, this kind of beauty begins to emerge. It comes forth when you stop fighting time, when you stop chasing validation in other people's mirrors, when you realize that your story, with all its pain and all its choices, is worth celebrating. This kind of beauty appears in the woman who walks alone and does not feel lonely, in the man who cries in silence and sees no weakness in it, in the voice that can remain quiet without betraying itself, in decisions that need no explanation, in love that demands nothing. At this point, the soul begins to speak its own language, and that language is presence. You begin to feel what it truly means to be here. You start to sense the difference between hearing and listening with the heart, between talking and saying something that truly matters. Relationships also change. You naturally drift away from what drains you and draw closer to what nourishes you. And when no one else is around, you discover that you've learned to keep yourself company. That is freedom. When solitude no longer means absence, but the presence of the self. When silence is no longer uncomfortable, but becomes a refuge. When time is no longer counted, but becomes space. Space to breathe, to remember, to feel, to exist more lightly. At 60, you realize you no longer need to explain yourself. You simply are. And those who see you will stay. Those who don't will leave. But that no longer hurts, because you understand a soul can only be recognized by another awakened soul. And in that quiet, wordless recognition lies the truest connection, a connection that doesn't bind, demand, or control, a connection that simply allows, like a meeting between mirrors, like a dance in silence, like the certainty that despite everything, a life of wholeness is still possible. When the soul changes direction, everything that was hidden begins to rise, sometimes as a soft breeze, sometimes as an inner tremor, but it always comes with an invitation. Be who you are at last, and without fear. And that requires letting go of old versions of yourself, of stories others told about you, of the need to be useful, productive, admired, perfect. At 60, what matters is not what you do, but how you feel as you do it. It's the intention behind the act. It's the soul behind the word. You begin to understand that many of your greatest lessons came from pain. Not from pain itself, but from how you moved through it, from the decisions you made while still wounded, from the moments you stayed silent when everything inside you screamed, from the boundaries you drew after giving in for so long. This invisible repertoire is what carries you now. It doesn't show up in diplomas or public praise, but in the way you rise each morning, in the way you look at the people you love, in the way you forgive quietly and without drama. As the soul matures, it learns to trust, not others, but itself. It recognizes signs it once missed. It feels the body with greater mindfulness. It honors inner cycles. It knows when to speak and when to stay silent, even with trembling lips. That is not weakness. It's wisdom. It is what remains when the outer layers no longer hold. It is what blooms when the shell falls away. It is what lives when you choose, without fear, to be yourself.
Jung said, "The second half of life is not about conquest, but about integration. It's the phase when everything once separated begins to come together. The forgotten feminine, the suppressed masculine, the wounded child, the wise elder. All parts meet, look into each other's eyes and recognize themselves. And from this meeting, a new strength is born. Not a strength that dominates, but one that sustains, one that holds, one that remains. A strength that needs no spotlight, because it shines from within. This is the strength that carries the soul through the years without fading. It asks for little, only truth, only silence, only the courage to never abandon yourself again. There comes a moment when everything falls into alignment, not because the world has changed, but because something within you has finally found peace. At 60, the soul no longer wants speed. It longs for depth. It no longer needs final answers. It seeks presence. It no longer wants to conquer the world. It wants peace in its own body. At this point, many realize that life was never about having, it was about being. Being who you are, even if no one understands. Remaining true to your truth, even if it's not well received. Being whole, even if you've been broken 1,000 times. By 60, the losses have left their marks. The illusions have been tested. The roads have shown both their shortcuts and their cliffs. And still there's something inside you that keeps going, that breathes, that dreams, that wants to live, not out of duty, but out of joy. This desire to keep going lightly is proof that the soul is alive. Carl Jung saw this phase as the most sacred because it's the time when the ego bows before the soul, when the outer world fades in importance and the inner world becomes a temple. When you learn to walk without carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, when you finally understand that you're allowed to rest in yourself. And this resting is not passivity, it is reconciliation with your own story, with your body, with time, with light, and with shadow. In that stillness that's to unfold, not the one you were told, but the one you found yourself through it all. If you've read this far, perhaps you feel that call within. Perhaps you've recognized parts of yourself in these words, parts that have long been asleep. And if something in this touched you, write a sentence in the comments that expresses this new chapter in you. A quiet decision, an inner vow, a message from your soul. And if you feel this video might touch someone else who is going through this curve, share it with them. And if you want to continue this journey with us, a place where the soul is allowed to breathe, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here every silence is given a voice and every story a space to bloom.